Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Reason and Theology show. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, on a Saturday morning with a debate thesis that we're discussing between Thomas Druschke, an atheist, and Anthony Brooks, a Presbyterian. We are going to be discussing, are there sufficient arguments for God's existence? So before I actually give the bio on each, let me go ahead and just greet you both. Thomas, Anthony, how are y'all doing?
I'm doing well, man. That's great to be on here. Glad to
Excellent.
be included.
Doing great. Glad to be back.
Yeah, I'm excited to have y'all. And Anthony, you're coming from a presuppositionalist perspective, correct?
Yes, sir.
And Thomas, I think from the way you were explaining it, you are an atheist as far as belief, but agnostic as far as knowledge claims about whether God exists. Is that accurately representing your perspective?
Yes, I believe so, and that more comes from about the concept of the null hypothesis. It
Mhm,
just seems to me the most intellectually honest position to hold,
mhm,
because I'm not making a knowledge claim about the existence or non-existence of an entity, because we don't have any evidence for or against that position.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, and I think it's important that you made that distinction because a lot of people, when they hear atheist, they think that you're saying you know that there is no God, and that's not exactly what you're saying. You're just saying you haven't seen any evidence for it, so you are agnostic in that aspect.
Correct. And that's kind of why I just lean towards that particular bent, because it leaves me open to the possibility of perhaps such a supernatural entity does exist. And we may at some point find a way to test that hypothesis,
Mhm,
confirm the results, and thus have evidence for or against one way or the other.
mhm. Well, hopefully, Anthony will be able to establish his position, maybe give you some sufficient arguments. So let me go ahead and introduce both of y'all as far as your bio. Thomas Druschke is a self-studied philosopher and an atheist living in Lufkin, Texas. He's been active in debate and Socratic societies, most notably at Kilgore College since 2014. He's currently a law student seeking to become an attorney. He's been working on a blog entitled The Atheist Reformation, which is in the process of being migrated to minds.com. Anthony Brooks is a blogger and apologist at the Reformed Review, where he defends Reformed Christianity from atheists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, and other opposing worldviews. He's been a guest on multiple podcasts, including Soteriology 101, Defending the Reformed Faith. Anthony has also combated the culture of death by supporting and engaging in ministries to end abortion in America. Anthony, I think you were telling me about that the other day. I want to say y'all had some kind of hand in I forget what city it is in Texas. I always drive through it, but it starts with a
Wascom,
W. Uh,
Wascom, Texas.
yeah, but there's
That
a Wascom over there in Texas. I think you were doing some work in Wascom with abortion.
well, Right to Life East Texas was the organization that was working on helping the city establish its goal of becoming a sanctuary city for the unborn. It was mostly due to the efforts of Mark Lee Dixon and Rusty Thomas, um, who Mark Lee Dixon is the Right to Life East Texas leader, and Rusty Thomas, of course, with Saving American Ministries. Both of them worked really hard with the aid of others to help push this forward in Wascom, Texas. I was there at the city council meeting. I did not speak at the meeting. Um,
Mhm,
uh, as far as the arguments to persuade the city council, but
mhm,
I was there and I got to see that, and it was really cool. I also provided transportation and other needs there, and it was a really awesome experience because Wascom, Texas, is the first city in America to establish a city ordinance,
mhm.
uh, a bylaw outlawing abortion in the city limits. So that was a really cool thing to see.
Awesome, awesome. Well, hey, I commend you for being a part of that. I really do appreciate that. That's definitely a topic that I want to discuss with you in the future. So let's go ahead and dive into the debate. So this is going to be pretty much more of a free form debate. There's going to be some loose structure to it. Anthony, you're going to go first, just establishing your position. There's no time parameters here. Thomas, then you'll come and establish your position. Um, And then after that, y'all will just kind of have a free-form cross-examination where you just interact with each other with questions and answers. Thomas, you'll go first with that, and then y'all just lead it from there. And then we'll have just a brief closing where Anthony, you'll give your concluding thoughts, and then Thomas, you'll give your concluding thoughts, and then I'll open up the chat. Of course, actually the chat's already going, but y'all can go ahead, put in your chat questions, send them to @Reason and Theology in the YouTube chat, and then I'll read them at that time. So that will be probably roughly an hour from now. So we'll have a free-form debate for roughly 50 minutes to an hour, and then questions from the chat. How does that sound, guys?
Sounds great. Let's do it.
All right, Anthony,
Yeah,
go
sounds like
ahead and. Oh, I'm sorry, Thomas. Anthony, go ahead and establish your position. What would you say are sufficient arguments for God's existence?
Well, I first want to start out by saying that this was a question that I had to bring to myself. What is a valid worldview? What is the most logical and coherent worldview to hold, and that comports with the reality around us? And ultimately, I approach this from a worldview structure. A lot of people have an issue with my approach because it tends to lead towards circularity. As Thomas, I'm sure, is going to bring out later, revelational epistemology, and how revelational epistemology tends to end in a circular argument. But ultimately, the question for me isn't whether necessarily does God just exist. It's whether the worldview surrounding God's existence is a coherent worldview to hold. So when I started to approach this question, I attacked it from many different points of view. I wanted to know how I could defend my beliefs in a coherent system. So I would step into the naturalistic materialist worldview. I would step into the Muslim worldview. I would step in, of course, into the Christian worldview, which I already hold. And I wanted to know which worldview held the most weight, which one is the most coherent. So ultimately, the question comes down to, how do we really know anything? How do we justify the world around us? How do we justify the laws of logic, the laws of nature, the laws of mathematics? How do we justify any of this? So ultimately, when I stepped into the naturalistic materialist worldview, what I really understood from the atheist worldview was that it creates more questions than it answers. It tends to end in circularity as well, but the difference between the atheist worldview ending in circularity and the Christian worldview ending in circularity, and these are things I'm going to go into more detail, I'm not just going to leave it here, is that in the Christian worldview, with a revelational epistemology, with us appealing to an ultimate authority such as God and His Word, ultimate authorities are self-authenticating. They tend to appeal to themselves because there's nothing higher than themselves. But with the atheist worldview, what you get is ultimately the question of, how do you justify the uniformity of nature? How do you justify the laws of logic? And ultimately that ends in circularity. But unlike the Christian worldview, it does not appeal to an ultimate authority. What it does is it creates more questions than it answers. So if I'm gonna ask, how do we justify the uniformity of nature? You end up begging the question to justify that. So as David Hume and Bertrand Russell both pointed out, Bertrand Russell most famously in his Problems in Philosophy, is that we cannot appeal to the past to justify the future. We cannot say it is going to be in the future what it was in the past, or in the future gravity is going to pull me down towards the Earth's center at 9.8 meters per second squared, because it did in the past. Ultimately, that leads to begging the question, which leads to circularity, which leads to its logical fallacy. And since the uniformity of nature is still a question that science has yet to answer, there are hypotheses put in place. Gordon Stein most famously posited in his famous debate with Greg Bahnsen, he appealed to the properties of matter. Well, it doesn't matter how small you get. You can get down to the atomic level. We just don't know that the properties of matter are going to work the same way as they would in the past, because ultimately you're still begging the question. So that was a logical fallacy that I ran into in the atheist worldview, and there are of course other issues, especially with the properties of matter and the properties of the human mind, the human condition. Of course, the issue of the laws of logic, and how do we justify the laws of logic as well. So there are many things that I'm pretty sure will come out in this debate. Hopefully, we can get further than just accusing me of begging the question. Hopefully, we can get some of these answers out. But ultimately, my position is strictly presuppositional. I start with the Word of God, and I reason from God down to us. And as I think that we'll see, what Thomas is going to do is he's going to start with man. He's going to reason outwards towards the rest of nature, and what man knows as is reliant on the rest of nature and science. So ultimately, what I do want to point out is that I want the audience to focus on what we are standing on, not physically, but metaphysically. If you look at what I'm professing and you look at my feet and see what I'm standing on, you're going to see that I'm standing on the God of the Bible. You're going to see that I'm standing on the Scriptures as the ultimate infallible Word of God. If you look at what Thomas is standing on, he's going to be I'm going to be professing A. He's going to be saying not A, but he's still going to be standing on A. And I want to hopefully be able to bring that out in this debate today. I just hope that this is a fun discussion, that we can have a useful discussion here. So I'm just going to leave it there, and hopefully more of that will be drawn out in the cross-examination.
Okay, so Thomas, what are your thoughts on that, and perhaps establish your own position?
Okay, well, it's a pretty accurate representation of Anthony's position. It seems to have become a bit more refined since last he and I discussed this a while back at the Socratic Society at Kilgore College. My primary criticism of this would be what's affectionately referred to as the nope argument. And this is something proposed by a guy named Ned, goes on YouTube by the handle of Negation of P. And NOPE is actually an acronym, stands for Negation of Presuppositional Enlightenment. It's a standalone argument. It's independent of consciousness, and even arguments for the primacy of existence. So, and this is primarily addressing uniformity of nature to a certain degree. This one, not necessarily, and I'll get into that here in a moment. But it starts with, if the universe exists, as the presuppositionalist would have us believe, then there are no fundamental properties governing the universe, rendering everything subjective and therefore unknowable. So effectively, the presuppositionalist is not only faced with the inability to claim absolute knowledge of any fact, but if true, that type of universe renders absolute knowledge irrational, unattainable, and most importantly, non-existent. And the reason for this would be that, pardon me, God is described as, the three omnis: omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. Omniscient and omnipresent don't really much feed into this argument, but omnipotent does. We see throughout the Bible and throughout descriptions of Christianity and even Judaism, since we're talking about Abrahamic religions, that God suspends the laws of physics and changes things in the natural world through miraculous works. So that would make every law of nature, every law of physics, every law of mathematics entirely subject to the mind of God. And so there's no real objective standpoint. Yes, you're appealing to what is declared as an ultimate authority, but what makes that authority ultimate? We don't really have an answer for that, or at least none that I've heard brought forth. And that's pretty much my primary issues with that argument, in all honesty.
Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and enter into our cross-examination period, where free form, y'all are just going to go ahead and dialogue with each other, ask each other questions and answers. Thomas, let's start with you, though.
Okay. You talk about not appealing to the past to justify the present. Science doesn't really do that. We don't necessarily appeal to the past. It's more of we make these observations. These observations continue to be reliable, and yes, they were made in the past, but we still routinely test those observations again in the here and now before going further in other things. Do we pick up and drop a pen and measure its drop rate or its acceleration due to gravity every time we go to do an experiment on g-forces? No, not necessarily. But we have ideas through gravimetrics of what we're going to do before we conduct that experiment. So a question I would have, not necessarily pertaining to that, I'm sorry, my train of thought kind of went wild on that one, is uniformity of nature. How do you address the ultimate subjectivity of it?
Can you clarify what you mean by subjectivity?
In that laws of physics, laws of nature, God suspends them through miraculous works. We see that in the Bible, such as the parting of the Red Sea with Moses. If that were to be literally true, now I'm not accusing you of being a biblical literalist. I'm just saying going based on things that are touted as miracles attributed to God. There is not a physical way in which that body of water could part in that fashion. So would require the suspension or the wanton dismissal of the laws of physics in at least that local area for the duration of the miracle. And since that can be changed at any time due to being subject to the will of God, how can you call that uniformity of nature when at any given moment God could decide to change everything?
Okay, so I mean, I understand what you mean by subjectivity. Of course, he didn't want to accuse me of being a biblical literist. It really depends on the passage. Of course, I do accept the miracles and the Bible's the specific reference to the parting of the Red Sea. My explanation of this is that the uniformity of nature means that nature is uniform. Now, if God decides to suspend the laws of nature to accomplish his will, then that's his will. Outside of his influence on those laws, nature will act the way that he created it. That he created it to act. So I would simply say that if he means that the uniformity of nature is subject to God, then yes, I would agree with that. So ultimately, my answer is that if God does not interfere with the laws of nature, with the natural law, with the physical realm, then nature will act uniform in all circumstances until he decides that, hey, I'm going to part the Red Sea, or hey, I'm going to turn water into wine. It's his right to suspend the uniformity of nature, to suspend the laws of nature to accomplish his will. So I don't really understand how that could really be an argument against my position. Ultimately, my position is that God is the supreme sovereign king over the universe, that he created the natural law, he created the natural order. Therefore, it is his to suspend if he wants to. But if he does not suspend those laws, then the laws will continue to act uniform until he does. So
My question, I guess, at that point would be understanding that this is indeed a subjective aspect if looked at through the perspective of God's existence. Then you can't actually claim uniformity of nature. You're claiming uniformity of nature absent action from the deity, from God. So you can't actually argue for uniformity. You're assuming uniformity the same as any other worldview would. So I'm not necessarily attacking the argument at its core, just saying that that particular ground on which part of your argument stands would be invalid.
I don't see how I don't believe in uniformity of nature, to be honest. My argument is that nature is uniform. God created it to be uniform. He holds it in in suspension in that way. If he decides to suspend natural law, that's his prerogative. But when he's done suspending natural law, for whatever reason, whether it was to part the Red Sea, last time I checked, the Red Sea went back to the way that it was before and drowned Pharaoh's army. So, at least on the biblical narrative side, I know that you have arguments against that. But ultimately, my uh, my position is that nature is uniform. It's ultimately uniform. If God decides to suspend the uniformity of nature, that's still not an argument against the uniformity of nature. Last time I checked, if I pick up my shoe and I drop on the floor, it's still going to drop at the same rate of speed unless God decides to make it float. So, if he decides to interfere in the natural affairs of nature and man and science, then that's his prerogative. But until he does that, nature's uniform. So, I really don't see how that's an argument against me believing in the uniformity of nature. I believe in the uniformity of nature. Last time I checked, when I get out of bed, I don't float up to the ceiling.
I didn't say you couldn't believe in it. I said you couldn't assert knowledge of it based on what your claim of God can do. So now, another question I have is: you say that God maintains a uniformity of nature. How has he done that? How can we know, approaching this from a completely non-Christian, non-Abrahamic side of things? What did God say in maintaining the uniformity of nature? What did he say he would do? I'm sorry if it seems like I'm putting you on the spot. I'm not asking you to like quote, chapter and verse or anything like that. Just a general reply of what was said is perfectly all right. I don't want it to feel like I'm putting you on the spot.
Well, I don't actually understand your question, but that's actually my point, is that how can we know that nature is uniform outside of God? Um, so I guess my premise was actually assumed in your question, if I'm understanding your question correctly. But exactly what did God say that He was going to do is that He was going to create the universe. He created it good. When man fell, not only man was plunged into sin, but nature was plunged into corruptibility, as in death entered the world. That's where we get our natural calamities and things, at least from a Christian perspective. Um, but as for the overall uniformity of nature and the natural law, the laws of logic, the laws of mathematics, um, and things like that, we believe as Christians that those are reflected in the mind of God. They were not created by Him, but they reflect Him. If they were created by Him, then that would mean that God has a possibility of being illogical. Of course, that would go against, that would fly in the face of Christian theology in the realm of, um, we believe in a logical God, not an illogical God. If there's a possibility of God being illogical, then that would be a problem. So, if there's a possibility of God, uh, uh, let's say, contradicting the law of non-contradiction, that would make him dishonest. Something that is illogical is inherently dishonest. So, if I say something that is illogical today, which I think would actually be consistent with your worldview, which I don't believe that you are illogical. I think that you're a very logical human being for as long as I've known you. Um, the sense that you're giving me a coherent response to my statements, and you're asking coherent questions instead of saying something like, my my car has no legs and I want to go eat peanut butter off the ceiling. Um, I assume that you are standing on my foundation. Now, you might disagree with that, but ultimately, when it comes down to it, not being able to justify how we are even able to have this conversation, I think, is a huge problem from your worldview.
Except that justifying reason isn't really the issue. It's more, are there sufficient arguments for the existence of the deity? So getting down into the weeds of saying, well, how do you know this? How do you know that? How do you justify your ability to reason? It doesn't really have anything to do with, say, the nope argument. The nope argument it's a standalone. It's independent of any one consciousness. It's even independent of the primacy of existence. And so what it comes down to is, from a foundational standpoint, you're using the same or similar justification, or trying to justify, is induction, inductive reasoning, inductive arguments. And that's what our arguments concerning the uniformity of nature are, such as the laws of nature. Assuming the existence of a deity can't justify induction, you're still going to be forced to resort to evidence to discern a better and worse inductive inference. And so, if we look at God's promise to maintain the uniformity of nature, that raises quite a few questions, such as, at least as far as I know in my knowledge of the Bible, is that it's not been revealed which inductive inferences are correct, such as ones which would track the maintained uniformity of nature to those which aren't. His maintenance of nature's uniformity doesn't make inductive inferences truth preserving or anything of that kind. So even if this uniformity is maintained by a deity, and it has, say, revealed this in such a way that we can know it to be certain, I believe that's generally what is said, it still doesn't tell us which inductive inferences can be successfully made. Like, for instance, the Bible doesn't have a comprehensive list of potential inferences which would be guaranteed to be successful if made. In a good example, that would be, say, a full description of the laws of nature, telling us the drop rate of gravity, even if it were in the units of the time of that era. We would be able to convert that mathematically to be understood in how we represent mathematics today. Or perhaps the laws of thermodynamics, such as the law of entropy and things of that nature, where things tend to towards disorder in a closed system. So, given all of that, and that those things aren't there, knowing or claiming to know that a God guarantees this regularity, it really doesn't help if you don't know precisely which regularity is going to be guaranteed. So again, any theistic perspective would still have no option but to resort to evidential tools that we use to distinguish between more and less rational inductive inferences. Because inductive inferences can be rational, they're just difficult to justify.
Okay, so let me respond to that real quickly. Your basic argument is that the Bible doesn't tell us which inductive inferences we should questions that we should ask. It doesn't tell us the rate at which gravity pulls us down towards the center of the Earth. It doesn't tell us the laws of thermodynamics. It doesn't give us a comprehensive list of the laws of nature or even the laws of logic. The Bible's not a scientific textbook. It's not a science textbook. The Bible tells us who God is as much as he wants us to know. The Bible tells us the plan of redemption. The Bible tells us that God wants us to establish justice at the gate, that he wants us to have a moral standing in society, that he wants to establish the image of God in all human beings, and that he has done that through creation and through our birth. That all of us are given dignity. The Bible is ultimately a moral book. It is a redemptive book. It is a inherently theological book. It's not scientific. I see atheists attack the Bible all of the time because it says, God set the earth upon pillars. That's meant to be allegorical. The Bible also says that he hung the earth in nothing and that it was round. The scientific statements are there, I guess, but they're not intended to be inherently scientific. So just because the Bible does not give us a comprehensive list of the laws of thermodynamics does not mean that the Bible is wrong. Now, Going back to your
Hang on. I feel I need to interject something here. If you'll permit me, I don't want to cut off your train of thought. Are
as
you
long
okay
as
with me jumping in?
as long as I can return to it, I'm fine.
Oh, absolutely. I'm happy to let you return to it. So you say that the Bible is not a scientific text. Of course, I'm not trying to assert that it is in any way, and I'm not trying to force that position on you, since it's obviously a position you do not hold. It's more that your justification for uniformity of nature is still inductive. It still relies upon the scientific and evidential foundations that every other worldview that practices science or conducts scientific experiments, seeks scientific knowledge, uses. Assuming the existence of the God does not justify that induction, is what I'm saying. I'm not going for a tu quo que or an and you too fallacy, more along the lines of asserting the position that by assuming God, you can somehow justify the inductive argument that nature is uniform doesn't hold water, because that assumption does not make that true.
Well, I'm not trying to make that assumption. What I'm trying to say is that you make that assumption. Um, my argument is strictly an argument from the impossibility of the contrary. I'm not trying to make any positive ascension towards my worldview. I'm only saying that I have the worldview to justify it and you don't. Um, my argument essentially is, without God, you cannot know anything. That's essentially my argument. You cannot justify anything. The words coming out of your mouth are coherent. The words coming out of your mouth are logical. You're asking logical questions. Your sentence structure is logical. That is standing on the worldview that I am coming from. When I say that Christianity can justify the uniformity of nature, we have an essential belief in a being who created the universe and holds it in suspension.
But
It
the
holds
question
it
is,
in
what evidence do you have to support that?
the evidence that you don't.
Okay, so what experiment can I conduct that shows me that God has written these laws of nature, these laws of physics upon the universe, by which I test and find bits of data and whatnot and conduct experiments that comport with reality? What experiment can I conduct to show me that evidence that you claim to have that I don't?
What experiment can what experiment can you conduct to show that the laws of nature are even true? That they are actually a thing? That
Well,
can you hold on? Can you weigh a law of nature? Can you weigh a law of logic? Can you measure it? No, you cannot. They are transcendent. They are abstractions. They transcend time and space. Now, I know what you're going to say. You are going to say that they are simply abstractions that are communal, that men have formulated to understand the world around us. And I got that. So that's going to take me into my next question.
Okay, so let me go ahead and address that real quick, just to make sure we drive that point home. Is that okay? No, I can't go out there and weigh the law of gravity. I can't go out there and weigh that. However, I can test that stated abstraction. Is that when things fall, they fall towards the center of a more massive object by, say, picking up a water bottle and dropping it, and I can measure its acceleration due to the speed of gravity. Does that establish the existence of the law of gravity? No, but it is a representation of the phenomenon of gravity, the natural occurrence of gravity. So, no, a law of nature, a law of logic cannot be weighed or measured. They are abstractions, they are statements of human thought by which we understand natural phenomena. There could be no people in existence, there could be no life in this universe at all. And if something were to be picked up by a solar wind on Mars and the rock fell down or fell towards Mars, it would still accelerate just like gravity. Gravity would still be a thing. There would just be no mind, no conscious mind to understand and rationalize that natural phenomenon. So it doesn't change anything. They don't change the universe. They are just our verbal and written understanding of a particular phenomenon. But go ahead, go into your next question.
Okay, so how do you know that if you drop that water bottle, that it will continue every time you drop it to fall to the ground at 9.8 meters per second squared?
That's where induction comes in. It's the inductive argument that the law of gravity works.
Okay.
So every time I pick up that bottle and drop it, I should be able to test it. And by testing it, I justify it.
But how do you know it's not going to float towards the ceiling?
Because nothing else is doing it. I can look around my apartment, look around this room. Nothing else that has similar or less mass than the water bottle is suddenly floating. So I can make an induction and say, okay, gravity is still in effect. Do I know the exact measurement of that acceleration due to gravity? No, of course not. That would require a test. And that's why I'm saying you don't justify an inductive argument with more induction. That leads to circularity. You also can't justify induction with deduction. The way you justify an inductive argument or an inductive statement is through evidence, through testing.
But those tests are still in the past.
Okay, it doesn't matter if they're 2 seconds in the past. It's an inductive argument. You still have to operate on the assumption. Inductive arguments may not be all that great in philosophy, but they work quite well for science.
I mean, they work great for science, but science is inherently philosophical. I mean, the scientific method, the very foundation behind science, is a philosophical construct.
Yes, it's a highly specialized form of philosophy that is rooted in the natural world and studying the aspects and phenomena of reality.
Okay,
It goes a step further. It's a more specialized form of philosophy. Yes, that's well established.
Okay, so I think that we have thoroughly killed this subject. Do you have any more questions on another subject?
Not off the top of my head, but I guess I have a question. Are you claiming that inductive inferences beg the question?
I'm claiming that for an atheist to justify the principle of induction or to justify the uniformity of nature in more colloquial terms, for an atheist to justify even the laws of mathematics is inherently circular. And like I said earlier, with my epistemology is revelational. It appeals to an ultimate authority. There's no authority higher than that, than the authority that I'm appealing to, because that is my presupposition. What the atheist has to do is they have to presuppose the uniformity of nature. What the atheist has to do is they have to presuppose the laws of mathematics. They have to presuppose the laws of logic. And that ultimately leads the atheist in a position where they cannot really understand or have a justification for their ability to reason, for their ability to even do science. So ultimately, I think that the entire materialist worldview ends up in circularity. Now, that's not saying anything against you. You're a very logical and coherent being, like I've said earlier. That's saying that the worldview that you're coming from is inherently circular and ends in a logical fallacy.
Okay, so let's look at knowledge for a moment. And there's two ways of gaining knowledge, at least from a philosophical standpoint. You have a posteriori, that's through your senses. Those can be doubted, but it provides genuine content. Then you have pure reason, a priori. This is things you can claim to know for certain, however, it's completely devoid of content. So what you're claiming is you're claiming a priori knowledge. So you're claiming certainty, but it doesn't have any content because it doesn't offer a new route to any kind of knowledge. No presuppositional argument does. And in fact, we see when two opposing presuppositionalists, say from different faith backgrounds. In that form of revelational epistemology, it devolves into an infinite regress. It has to. There's no way for it not to, because you're using the same argument. Revelation is X can know P for certain if and only if God has revealed to X that P.
Okay, so let me respond to that real quick. So ultimately, that's why it's an argument from the impossibility contrary. I'm not claiming to prove my position by giving positive empirical evidence. In fact, I'm trying to actually avoid that, because I don't believe that that's my place. God doesn't need anyone to defend him. What I am claiming is that if you look at every other worldview and its lack of justification for the basic question of how we even know things, how we can do science, how we can do mathematics, if we take every other worldview and put it up to the light of scrutiny on a philosophical foundation, every other worldview comes back illogical. So it's an argument from the impossibility for that exact reason, is that I'm not claiming to be able to prove God's existence through empirical means. I'm claiming to be able to disprove every other worldview from being logical or even a foundational worldview. Secondly, revelational epistemology. I already knew that you were going to get to this. We discussed it earlier.
Mm-hmm.
That is why I opened my briefing by saying that I'm appealing to an ultimate authority. And you said that I don't have any content behind it. My content is what I'm saying, that every other worldview comes back illogical and really irrelevant. And the way that we engage the culture as Christians, I think, is really inconsistent from the different epistemologies that Christians tend to approach things from. Not just the epistemology of God, but also from the epistemology of neutrality, from the position of neutrality that some Christian apologists try to approach things from. So if we approach things from a classical point of view, which I think would be the position that Michael would mostly sympathize with, the classical apologist William Lane Craig, for example, even claims this, that he tries to approach the atheist from a point of neutrality and take the atheist's hand and guide him towards the Christian worldview to see that it is coherent. What I'm saying is that I'm not going to step into a point of neutrality. I'm going to say I believe in God, and every other worldview does not make sense. Every other worldview ends in circularity. That's my position. It's an argument from the impossibility contrary. So it's not an illogical position to approach things from. I'm saying that I have my presuppositions, and I'm going to step into the worldview of my opponent, and this really works for really any type of apologetics, whether it's towards a Muslim who is a person of faith or towards an atheist who is not. That I can show that their worldview is illogical from this position.
Okay, so essentially, what it seems to boil down to is it's a God of the gaps argument, because essentially what it boils down to, to its essence of what I can discern from the mantra of presuppositionalism, is that unless you know everything, or you were told by someone who did, it would be impossible to be certain about any matter of fact. So at that point, it's saying because we don't know something, or because we don't know everything, therefore God. That's what it ultimately boils down to. That's what it ultimately boils down to. Because the presuppositionalist claim is that there's this mystical third way of gaining knowledge through revelation. And that's where the whole infinite regress issue comes into play. How do you know your version of revelational epistemology is better than, say, a Muslim's, or perhaps there's a Jehovah's Witness presuppositionalist, or a Buddhist presup out there who would argue in a similar, if not exactly the same way that you're talking about with presuppositionalism, but have a different ultimate authority, or one that is at least to some degree contrary to the one you assert exists. And that's why I'm saying is that presuppositionalism doesn't offer us anything. It is entirely devoid of content.
Okay, so number one, it depends on the worldview, is how I'm going to approach it. So with the Muslim's epistemology basically breaks down where he claims that the New Testament and the Old Testament are God's revelation. The Quran claims that any revelation from God is infallible and cannot be corrupted, yet they believe that the Bible's been corrupted. So that's where the Muslims' epistemology basically breaks down. Number two, it really, like I said earlier, it really depends on the epistemology. If I can show that every other worldview is incoherent and my worldview is the only one standing, then I have the valid worldview.
Not necessarily.
Unless we
That
just
doesn't that
delve
doesn't
into, unless we delve into solipsism.
it does well solipsism, neither here nor there on this one. Just because you've shown everything else to be incoherent, as you say, that does not by default make yours coherent, because yours is not the opposite in the law of identity or law of non-contradiction when compared to these other worldviews. In, say, Christianity versus Islam, it is either Islam or not Islam, Christianity or not Christianity. If you can demonstrate not Islam, that doesn't mean yes Christianity, because you still have not eliminated the potential contrary of not Christianity. So, okay, congratulations, you were able to dismiss a worldview. You were able to dismiss an epistemology. That does not justify yours.
Okay, so let me respond to that one real quick. And I actually anticipated the God of the Gaps theory, so I'm going to also try to cover that in this answer as well.
Go for it.
So let me first answer your last point. What I am saying is that if I'm not saying that I'm approaching atheism with saying that if atheism is false, then Christianity is true. I don't see any logical coherence in any other religion, and trust me, I've looked. Probably the closest that comes to my position is Judaism, and that's because we share a common root in basically half the Bible, and the same set of moral commandments and the same prophecies about the Messiah. The only difference is I believe the prophecies have come true and they don't. So Judaism, to an extent, maybe could be a valid contender. But ultimately, I think that their worldview falls down on a theological level, not necessarily an epistemological level. With Islam, I've already demonstrated that their epistemology basically falls apart. And we can go down the list why each other religion falls apart. Basically, the answer with the atheist is either God or not God. If I can show that not God does not make sense, that not God is illogical, then you're only left with God. That's the dichotomy, and it's not a false dichotomy. I mean, if it comes down to either there's a God or there's not God, and I can show that not God does not make sense, then God. Number two, the God of the Gaps argument. And I think I just answered this actually in my last statement. I'm not inserting God into the gaps of our understanding. What I'm saying is that if not God does not make sense, then God is the only logical explanation.
The only issue that I see with that is that you still haven't demonstrated that the position of presuppositionalism is somehow not ultimately begging the question, just appealing to an authority. And just appealing to an authority, whether ultimate or otherwise, it still doesn't justify the position. It's
Can I answer your question real quick?
Sure. And before you do that, I also want to say that I just looked at the time and realized that I have pretty much monopolized the examination of asking questions and that, and I want to apologize and cede any remaining time to you.
Well, hold on. The format was that you get to ask questions, and if I have any counter questions, I'd ask them.
Okay.
I did have a couple, and we've already gone through that. So basically, I already answered this. Begging the question is allowed. A circular argument is allowed if it's appealing to an ultimate authority. It's not illogical to appeal to something that is the greatest that it can be to justify itself. So your natural question would be, well, how do we know that the Bible is the greatest authority? Well, we can go into that in another discussion. We already agreed before this discussion that we wouldn't get off topic of the subject of God. So I'm trying not to do that. And I am looking at the time, Michael, and it looks like that we are coming up on 10:30. So we might open it up or go into closing statements here after me and him are done with this line of questioning. But ultimately, when it comes down to my argument today, is I'm saying, I'm going to go ahead and summarize it real quick before we go into closing, that without God, you cannot know anything. So if I can demonstrate that there being no God is an illogical position, then God is the only thing that is left. So I think that I want to open it up to Thomas to make his final remarks, and then I'll make mine, and then we can go into some questions.
I think we actually had where I was going to do my closing statement last, since you opened. Do you want that last statement that you made to be your closing, or would you like to add to that before I go into that?
Well, I would like to hear what you have to say, and then respond to any final remarks that you have, just so I can establish my burden of proof, if that's okay with you.
I would leave that up to the host. Michael?
Preferably, I'd like, Anthony, for you to go first and Thomas to conclude, just because you're the one making the argument, so it would only be fair for Thomas to conclude with his rebuttal, or during the conclusion.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. So I guess I'll go ahead and start. So basically, my premise is, I'm setting up a dichotomy here, either God or not God. That's my premise. I've already discussed in the previous line of questioning in my opening that without God, you cannot justify the basic tenets of what it means to be a human being. What are the experience around us, what we are understanding, what we are thinking. As human beings, I think that we tend to take the basic philosophical realities of the laws of logic, mathematics, the uniformity of nature. We don't get up out of bed in the morning expecting to float up to the ceiling. We expect the Earth and its gravitational pull to do what it has done all along. And I think that Thomas has demonstrated that when we continue to ask the same question over and over again, or continue to make the same statement over and over again, does not make it true. He's saying that Christianity cannot justify the principle of induction, the problem of induction. I think that it can, by showing that the atheist does not have a justification for it, and that we do. I think that proves my position this evening, or this afternoon. Basically, what we are trying to understand is, how is nature uniform? How am I going to get out of bed and not expect to float to the ceiling? And as Bertrand Russell and David Hume have pointed out, regularity in the past does not result in predictability in the future. It really doesn't. Philosophically, that just falls on its face, and if it's philosophically inconsistent and logically inconsistent, then we can't expect for that to be a scientific consistency. He made the statement, and I think it's actually an amazing statement, that induction does not necessarily work in philosophy, but it works great in science. Well, maybe when it comes to the need to test and retest and retest and retest, but how do we know that one day that they'll be testing the gravitational pull on a certain object, and it's 9.7 meter per second squared instead of 9.8? We don't know this. We really don't. And so it's basically just left guessing. So my thesis statement, and this will always be my thesis statement in discussions like this, is without God, you cannot know anything. And I do believe that. So without God, we cannot understand the uniformity of nature. Without God, basically, we're just time and chance acting. All we have is time and chance acting on matter. Our brains are basically chemical reactions, and we really don't have any level of free will in that, because all we have is chemical reactions going on. And so he's reacting in an atheistic way, I'm reacting in a theistic way, and we really don't have any level of freedom outside of time and chance acting on matter. That's basically all we have. And I'm not trying to make the Dr. Pepper example and Mountain Dew example like certain presuppositionalists like to make. All I'm saying is I do believe that if all you have is time and chance acting on matter, you really cannot have any level of knowledge of the future. You cannot have any certainty, and without certainty, you really don't have a reason to continue in the in the life that you've been given.
Okay. Are you done? Okay. So to close everything up, to sum everything up for myself, is I think that just about any viewer, listener can discern from the podcast that at no point did you actually address most of the subjects of my questions of how can you show that appealing to this ultimate authority you can somehow justify induction. The reason why induction is reliable in science is because we've been able to rely on evidence, and that's how we justify the induction. At the end of the day, appealing to an authority, ultimate, penultimate, or otherwise, it does not justify that. And at the very least, you haven't established a good or sufficient argument for the existence of God, at least not to my understanding here. So to close it all off, the Dr. Pepper analogy, fizz and whatnot, and uncertainty is you're establishing, and still through a bit of a God of the gaps argument, you're saying that because I don't know everything, I have to rely on somebody who does. That's not necessary. There's no necessity in that. No necessity established. And I suppose that in closing, uncertainty isn't a bad thing. Do we claim to know everything? No. Do we claim to know everything for certain? No. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just because you don't have certainty in something doesn't make it bad or illogical or incoherent. It just means we don't know. And so we strive to discover more so that we may know more. And I believe that's it for me. Michael, all yours.
Okay, so let me ask a couple questions to each of you before we jump into the questions from the chat. So, Thomas, if I understand your position correctly, you're essentially saying that we can't assume knowledge on the part of nature because, from the Christian perspective, there could be miracles that could interrupt that, and also because we just don't know. There's no experiment that we can conduct to make sure that this is going to be reliable in the future. Is that correct? Am I understanding it correctly?
Yes, you're understanding it correctly. And the only thing I would add to that is the insertion of a deity does not somehow provide justification for the precise point that the deity is asserted to be omnipotent and as such can suspend the laws of nature and physics whenever they deem fit. At
Okay.
which point it becomes subjective to the mind and so on and so forth. And so it still doesn't justify it. It's kicking the can further down the road. And ultimately, at least to my eyes, kind of becomes a God of the gaps argument because impossibility to the contrary, similar arguments were made in that when discussing creationism versus evolution, young earth versus old earth, and things like that.
But I mean, there could be a deity who's omnipotent, who does have laws of nature, who never interferes with the laws of nature and never commits miracles. So I don't exactly see that as being discounted.
Well, if I may,
Mhm.
I'm not saying that it's discounting the potential of a deity that doesn't interfere.
Mhm.
But at that point, if the deity exists, if the deity somehow created everything, and the
Mhm.
laws of nature, the laws of physics and mathematics are governing everything, and the deity does nothing, at that point, there is no difference between God or not God. But from the Christian perspective, from Christian theism, we see throughout the religious text suspensions of the laws of physics and the laws of nature.
Sure.
So this is obviously a deity who on top of being omnipotent, does interfere in the affairs of nature, at
Yeah.
which point that's where it becomes subjective and cannot be deemed justified based on that deity's existence.
All right, so help me out here. Let me make sure, help me. What am I missing here? To me, it seems like just because God can interfere with the laws of nature through miracles does not mean that we cannot ordinarily, reasonably assume that there are laws of nature that actually exist and that we can rely upon. What is wrong with us ordinarily assuming those things, given that miracles seem to be extremely rare? Why can we not assume these things ordinarily?
Oh, I'm not saying you can't assume these things ordinarily. I'm just
Well,
saying that your level of assumption is no different from mine. You're still making that same inductive statement relying upon these natural phenomena.
right.
What I'm saying is the existence of the deity doesn't justify it.
Mhm.
It doesn't explain anything. It doesn't offer a new route to knowledge. It's
Mhm.
just asserting.
Can I interject?
Sure.
Okay, so basically my argument from that standpoint, and I actually see a comment here that I'm going to want to get to eventually in the YouTube chat, is that what I'm saying is this: it's either God or not God. If not God does not make sense with the uniformity of nature, what is left? God. That's my argument. So if I can show that not God is basically saying that we have no justification for the uniformity of nature, it ends up begging the question. And Thomas's argument of all we're doing is just kicking the can down the road, then ultimately he is assuming that nature is uniform. He is assuming the principle of induction. I'm assuming that nature is uniform, yes, but what am I appealing to in that assumption to make the uniformity of nature not a logical fallacy? I'm appealing to an ultimate authority to justify the uniformity of nature, the great suspender of the natural law, if he chooses, or the sustainer of natural law, if he chooses. So that's what I'm appealing to. And his argument that miracles somehow make the uniformity of nature not uniform. I mean, yeah, the uniformity of nature is not uniform at a certain area, a certain place at a certain time when God decides to do a miracle in that place. Yeah, they're not uniform there, but that's his choice. Once he stops suspending those laws, they go back into play, and nature is uniform. But does him parting the Red Sea in the Middle East somehow make the Lake Superior in America any less uniform? No, because that miracle is not being performed in that area. So that was so honestly, that argument does not make sense. He's basically appealing to miracles as saying that we cannot believe in the uniformity of nature because we believe that God can do miracles, and I just don't see how that follows.
That's actually a misrepresentation of my point, and this was the point that I brought up in the debate, that you're not actually addressing my argument. I'm not saying that you can't rely on the uniformity of nature. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that you can't assert that nature is uniform or has uniform aspects to it, uniform natural phenomena. I'm saying that your assumption of the deity does not and cannot justify it. And at that point, your assumptions about the laws of nature are the same as mine. It's still inductive. The existence of the deity doesn't justify it, especially knowing that the deity in question does and has in the past, at any point, it could have only been once, but at any point has suspended the laws of physics or the laws of nature. But
So,
anyway, I think we're kind
okay.
of beating a dead horse with this one. If you'd like to
Well,
move on to another question, Mike, or if you want to stay on it, your show, your call, buddy.
well, I mean, I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
So you agree senses and experience, things like that, are ordinarily reliable. Obviously, there can be, you can be delusional, and so maybe your senses aren't functioning properly. ordinarily you agree with the reliability of the senses. Ordinarily, you believe that we can anticipate there to be cause and effect, that there are certain laws in the universe. It seems that you agree with that. And from
Yes, yes, I've never said I don't agree
right.
with that. I'm
And
not saying I
that's
don't agree with the
wonderful.
uniformity. What I disagree with is the justification by the insertion of a deity.
That's fine. But from my perspective as a class coming from a classical apologetic perspective, that's all you have to really agree to for me to show through cause and effect that there are uh, uh, reasonable proofs for God. If
How
you
so?
already believe in cause and effect, and there are effects here in the world, you have to have an ultimate uncaused cause, and we can tease that out perhaps in a future debate. But to me, as soon as you agree that the senses are ordinarily reliable and that there is causality ordinarily, we can just go right back to an uncaused cause, and that proves an unmoved mover. That proves that there is God. Now, that doesn't mean that it proves the Christian God
I would
necessarily.
like to interject something, if I may.
Sure.
So, accepting that causality, accepting that ordinarily we can rely on senses, and the gaining of a posteriori knowledge,
Mhm.
sense knowledge, that actually doesn't go all the way out to the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover, or anything like
Mhm.
that, because we don't know what is outside of our universe. We don't know what happens beyond the quote unquote start of the Big Bang. And that's really kind of a nebulous term to call it the start of the Big Bang to begin with,
Mhm.
because what it is physics and science reaches a point of singularity, at which point the mathematics breaks down. We
Mhm.
don't know that that is a definitive beginning.
Yeah.
That's the issue. And so at that point, we have cause and effect in our universe. We have no reason to assume that such a thing is outside of our universe, because we can't even argue from probability on that one, because Mike, can you hear me?
I lost you there, Thomas. Are you there?
I'm kind of pinging through my Anthony's, but
Yeah. Okay.
let me drop out of the call and jump back in, and
Okay.
I'll
Sure. Not a problem. Not a
let you
problem.
know where I cut off.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can tease this out another time. I don't want to take up all of y'all's time. I think that we can do that in a separate debate. I don't think that not knowing what exists outside of the universe somehow disproves what I'm saying, but we can address that in a different discussion. Anthony, let me ask you some questions. What would you say is wrong with the classical apologetical method versus what you're using? What's wrong with classical
Okay,
apologetics?
can you hear?
Yeah, I can hear you, Thomas.
Okay, so where did you lose me at? And I'll go
Well,
back over the.
I essentially heard you say that we don't know what's going on outside of our universe, so
Right,
we don't.
because
Yeah, and
just the last little bit then is
yeah.
that you have to look at it from, if you try to look at it from a probabilistic standpoint or a standpoint of probability, you have to look at your sample size. And we have this universe in which cause and effect occurs,
Mhm.
but it's still just this universe. It's a
But
sample
and
size of one.
that's all I need. I don't need to discuss anything outside of this universe. All we have to do is discuss what's inside this universe, and that will lead back to an uncaused cause. But I know you're not going to agree with that, and that's fine. What we can do is, perhaps a later date, we could have a discussion or a debate on that. And we can tease that out more because I don't want to
Sure,
take too much time from Anthony because I know I'm operating from a different perspective, so that's kind of taken away from where he's coming from.
of course, of
So we,
course.
we can tease that out, more in detail at another time. Um, Anthony, let me ask you, what do you think is wrong with the classical apologetic perspective?
Well, I don't want to harp on you on your own show. I know that as a Roman Catholic, you are bound to the classical apologetic method because that kind of came out of your stripe. Um, and to be fair, the reformers were most of the reformers took a classical approach, including all the way up to the late great R.C. Sproul. So um, I have deep respect for the classical point of view. I've learned many things from R.C. Sproul, William Lane Craig. So I want to start off prefacing my answer by that. Um, My main point of contention with the classical point of view is inherently moral and theological. What the classical point of view does is that it allows man to be the judge of the arguments. I don't want the individual that I'm trying to convince or an opponent that I'm trying to argue against that have that kind of authority over God to say that the arguments for or against his existence are valid or invalid, or evidentiary proofs are valid or invalid. And neither do I believe that a natural human being that is still sinful and fallen and has not been regenerated by the power of the Holy Spirit, neither do I believe that they're going to accept those evidences anyways. In Reformed theology and my position, the man is created and in the image of God, yes, but that image of God was corrupted in the fall to the point where man is in sin and fallen, and he cannot do anything to recover himself. So, coming from that point of view, if I present evidences to the fallen, unregenerate man, what is he going to do with those evidences? He's just going to argue against him until he's blue in the face. And this is strictly from a theological point of view. I'm not trying to offend Thomas in any way by saying this. So I tend to not use the classical proofs because I don't believe that there is a point of neutrality that I can walk from with the atheist. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were finished. Go ahead.
Well, all I was going to say is I'm a Christian. I have Christian presuppositions, and he's an atheist. He has atheist presuppositions. So, if unless the Holy Spirit regenerates his heart, he's not going to accept what I'm saying, anyways. Okay. So I'm not going to give up my presuppositions and start from a point of neutrality to guide him towards my arena when he's not even near my arena. He's on the opposite side of the earth from my arena, and he's going to reject it any possible way he can until the Holy Spirit interjects.
Well, so some of the points that you brought up, I guess we can discuss at a later time because I really don't want to take away from the chat questions. But let me just kind of tell you why I asked the question. The reason why I asked it is because I know that you believe in sense experience. I know that you believe that there are laws of nature. So don't you think, notwithstanding that the individual is unregenerate, notwithstanding that there is corruption and moral evil in the heart, don't you believe that there is some common ground when it comes to cause and effect that we can somehow induce back to an uncaused cause? Don't you think that does merit some attention when we have these discussions with atheists?
Well, I never said that the uncaused cause, or what you're probably referring to, the cosmological argument, has no merit. It has plenty of merit. I'm a Christian, and I appreciate the classical proofs as much as the next guy. But I want to not just discuss proofs with the atheist. I want to discuss how we know that proofs are really proofs. I want to understand why we need proofs, or why we can understand proofs. I want to take a step back and discuss the epistemology of the situation. How do we have the ability to know things? How do we have the ability to use logic and reason? Because until we get to proofs, proofs don't make really much sense if you're standing from the point of view, basically not being able to justify how you even have the ability to form a coherent sentence.
Sure. Of course, but it sounds to me like Thomas is already at least operating with an epistemology that believes ordinarily in the senses and cause and effect. So to me, it would seem at least helpful, although not completely sufficient. I mean, we don't want to just stop there and say, okay, now we've proved a God exists. That what do we do now? I mean, obviously we need to go further than that, but I do think that it could be helpful perhaps. And so that was what I was trying to get at is, but you're essentially saying you do see some merit for those kinds of arguments. You just don't think that it's entirely sufficient.
Not just some merit. I think that they're very meritorious arguments, and they're fun things to think about. That what exactly are they going to do to someone who's spent his whole life rejecting these things and becoming hardened to these things, and
It's a good start.
isn't a natural condition to blaspheme against these
Of
things.
course, it's insufficient. The individual can still go to hell, believing that there's an uncaused cause. So
Well, of course, and
it's insufficient.
you made the statement that Thomas is operating on the ability to have an ordinary understanding of these things, and I do believe that he does, but he doesn't have a justification for having that understanding.
Mhm.
That's my only point. Like you said, like Thomas said, it's your show, and I think we have roughly 20 minutes left.
Let's do some chat questions. My browser.
Can I address something real quick?
Mhm.
I'm looking at Ron Paul Road Warrior's comments.
Mhm.
I just want to thank him. Those are utterly hilarious. I love the me atheist, me correct because big words ooga booga, primarily because I absolutely love Captain Caveman. I love the reference. Thanks, man.
I'm not able to read the comment right now because my browser kicked me out. It's coming right back, but I remember the first question. It was from Ron Paul, Trip 2012 or something like that. And he asks for you, Thomas, how can something come from nothing, if I recall correctly?
How can something come from nothing?
Mhm.
We don't know. For instance, like if we go back to Big Bang cosmology, because I am making an assumption here, and that's where he's going to kind of go with, because I saw something about explaining what created the universe and such and such. Long story short, from a scientific standpoint, we don't know. There's nothing wrong with that. The issue that I take is asserting knowledge of something that you cannot show to be true, that you cannot show justification or evidence for. And so, if you go back to the point of singularity, where the Big Bang starts, to the best of our scientific knowledge, that's not something coming from nothing. That's something coming from something. So, at that point, it's not a philosophical nothing. Though I think questions like that would be better left to people who are actually learned and have backgrounds in cosmological physics and astrophysics and things like that. Lawrence Krauss gives some pretty interesting talks just on the topic of cosmology and astrophysics. So he would be someone that I would encourage someone to seek out and see kind of what they're saying on a few things, regardless of whether or not the man's an atheist. And that would probably provide a more succinct, or at least a better explanation than what I would. So I would have to defer to someone more knowledgeable than myself for specifics or nuanced takes on that.
Mhm. Kind of similar question. It says, this is from Luke Dalvin Horseshoer. For the atheist, does the world explain itself? Does it have to? Since experience is a subroutine of the given reality, does it explain anything or just describe the given from a perspective?
Does it? Would you mind reading through that one more time?
Yeah,
It seemed a bit word salady. I'm
very,
not wanting
yeah.
to be insulting to the individual or
Sure,
anything
sure.
like that. I'm thankful for the question.
The,
Just
the
not.
only
I want to
thing
make sure I understood it.
the
Oh,
only thing I'm really getting out of it is, does the world explain itself? I'm not sure what he means by the rest.
okay, so I'm going to read through this again. Does the world explain itself? Does it have to? The sense experience is a subroutine of the given reality. Does it explain anything or just describe it from a given perspective? I think is probably
Mhm.
more what that individual is trying to say. And it looks
Mhm.
like later on in the chat they bring up something called the continuum of causality.
Mhm.
Again, it would come down to the point as far as the whole causal loop or things of that nature. Uh, it would boil down to is we have no reason to assume that cause and effect exists outside of the universe because we have no evidence to support the hypothesis. Do we see cause and effect in the universe? Sure, we see it all the time. Uh, but that doesn't justify shoehorning it outside of our universe because we simply don't know. We don't have any information on that.
The other one looks like it says science was created from theology. You seem to think that science can replace theology, but isn't that just a superstitious dismissal of things that science cannot explain?
Superstitious denial of some things that science cannot explain. Well, the thing is, we have yet to find something that science can't explain or can't explain eventually. Did science come from theology? No, not really. There have been scientific advances done from theological perspectives. One that comes to mind personally is an individual, I believe he was a monk, Gregor Mendel, who gave us some insights into genetics and gene transmission over generations. Now, I don't know if he brought up the gene hypothesis then, just inheritable traits. I mean, so yes, theology or theological individuals have made advances in science here and there, but that would more get into something we discussed earlier: is to what level does theology actually provide to science? But to get off that rabbit trail, back to the core question: does science come from theology? It comes from philosophy. Science and scientific exploration existed prior to at least what we recognize as theology today. Yes, pantheism existed uh, back in the day in the ancient Greeks and whatnot, when they started into scientific exploration and whatnot, but they didn't assume the existence of Zeus or Hera when, say, Eratosthenes discerned the circumference of the Earth using the two sticks method, one in Alexandria, one in was either Cairo or Athens. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Anthony, there's a question from you from Brenda Von Otten. She says, what is Anthony's argument showing authority as a truth maker? Appealing to authority doesn't make a claim true.
Nope, it does not. That's my basic answer. So basically, my argument was posed in a way that appealing to an ultimate authority is not an illogical thing to do. Now, there's a separate question: what makes that authority ultimate, and is it a true authority? And that was the first premise of my argument. Set up that as the second premise, is that either there is God or not God. And if not God is shown to be illogical and circular and impossible on a philosophical and logical scale, then you would get God. So if not God is impossible, then you get God, and that sets up the question of ultimate authority. Me appealing to God to justify the uniformity of nature is the second premise. So it follows from the syllogism. So I'm not appealing to an ultimate authority to make a proof claim. That is why that was my second premise. So basically, my first premise was either God or not God. If it was proven to be not God, then God, being my second premise, is the ultimate authority. I can't appeal to him, and that makes it logical. So that's why I posed the argument in that direction. Brenda, I'm looking through the comments and I'm seeing that she has not understood my argument at all, and that's okay. I don't expect everyone to understand my argument in an hour. It took me a long time to study out my position to understand it myself. So I just encourage her to actually do some study. I can give, at the end of this program, I'll give a few people to go listen to, or look up and read to understand my position better. And I'm sure Thomas has already referenced a couple of people to understand his position better. So I hope that Brenda gets over her stubbornness that I'm seeing in these comments, because this is not helpful. I see that she did say in her last comment, God versus not God is not a true dichotomy. Actually, it is. That's literally a dichotomy. Either there's a God or there's not a God. I don't understand what she's saying is. How is that is a false dichotomy? I really don't.
Yeah, that I actually have to support you on that one, Anthony. I'm not really seeing that either. That's a clear illustration of the law of identity right there, and so is a true dichotomy. One thing I would like to address, if you'll permit me, Michael,
Mhm.
is I love one of the more recent comments from Luc Dalvin Horseshoer. He is at least a Neoplatonist. I actually consider that to some degree high praise. I've recently been looking into some early history and things of that nature, and Hypatia was a Neoplatonist, and she was a phenomenal mathematician and science communicator, so that was really cool. What's another one? Ron Paul Road Warriors. Science was created by pagans first, then it was advanced by Catholics, not atheists. There's plenty science cannot explain. Well, of course, that's why we do science, because we can't explain everything, and so we seek to try and explain it. I mean, that's a kind of a natural answer to that. It wasn't advanced just by Catholics. It was advanced by many people across many hundreds of years. Um, so I mean, and one can argue that science is still advanced today by atheists. So I'm not really sure why someone's theological bent really has to matter when it comes to science. But
Mhm.
but anyway, sorry, I'm hijacking. You're looking through and finding questions to ask. I'm ruining you as a host. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. What I was going to suggest is, to me, the only thing that looks like there really are remaining is some additional questions from Ron Paul. I didn't know if you wanted to take a few more of those. Other than
Uh,
that, it doesn't look like we have any more questions.
See this one. Every scientist was a believer until the French Revolution. The atheists have been bad scientists ever since. The lies of man-made or anthropogenic climate change by using manipulative software as an example. Wow. I believe that that's an incursion of a massive burden of proof by assuming that the software is manipulative, and I would love to see what he has on that, because I actually do agree with the concept of anthropogenic climate change. But either way. And do you mind if I address Brenda von Ozen
Mhm.
at the very end?
Sure.
Anthony needs to look up the Alex Malpass debate with Matt Slick's version of tag, which, yeah, that actually really does kind of correlate to what Anthony's been proposing here. No, Alex Malpass is a phenomenal philosopher, and Christian, atheist, potato. Listen to the guy. He is really good at explaining things where people can understand, from dense philosophical concepts all the way down to rudimentary stuff.
Well, I would like to actually respond to some of that. I have many disagreements with Matt Slick. I do not think that he is the best that my position actually has to offer, and some of the arguments that I made this evening are not are arguments that he would never make. And I think that's yes, I have used tag. I think that is a good argument. Um, uh, but ultimately, tag is basically the only thing that me and Matt Slick actually have in common in this discussion. Um, and guys to look up to understand my position, just real quickly, Cornelius Van Til is a good. I wouldn't say the best starting place. He was very. He was not a natural English speaker. His primary language was Dutch, so he got a little bit lost in translation sometimes when he was writing in English. But Greg Bonson, his famous debate with Gordon Stein, it's called The Great Debate. Does God exist? You can find it on YouTube. A very influential debate over me and my personal life. Greg Bonson won that debate hands down. I think even Gordon Stein actually conceded that. And there are other apologists. Douglas Wilson from Christchurch, Moscow, Idaho. He did a series of 3 debates with Christopher Hitchens. He has done debates with Dan Barker and other leading atheists. And many people have actually said that he's probably the only Christian debater that actually take down Christopher Hitchens. So I would strongly urge that you go look up Douglas Wilson's debates with Christopher Hitchens, and of course Dan Barker is another really good one. So that's the last of what I have to say.
I'm sorry, you had something, Thomas?
Yeah, I was actually gonna step back for a second and point to um, the most recent or the most recent question from Horseshoer or Luke and Ron Paul. I don't want to just take over your job and read the questions and then answer them, so I'll let you do that.
Well, if you want to go ahead and grab one or two of those, that's fine, and then we'll wrap it up. We're up
Okay.
against the clock at this
Okay.
point. Go ahead, man.
Sure. So, so Luke references seeking explanation without a ground for explanation. Is robust causality implicit in the idea of explanation? If you're referring to robust causality as far as cause and effect, yes, within this universe, yes, we use it. It's there. It's demonstrable as far as we can determine. As far as Ron Paul's question, so how can you make claims you cannot prove? I Getting past the colloquialism of the word prove, and that proof is really only for mathematics, not necessarily science. But how do we justify claims? We show evidence for them. That's it. We conduct an experiment after forming a hypothesis to test whether or not that hypothesis is valid.
Mhm.
And so we obtain evidence. But yeah. Also, Lauren Hallbrook's recommendation of A Universe from Nothing by Krauss. Yes, that is a very good read. It gets into some dense material, but it's still really good.
Here's a proposal I'd like to offer. Do y'all think that it would be helpful to perhaps have a roundtable discussion with us three, discussing these issues from a presuppositional, classical, and atheist perspective? Because I would like to challenge you both on different issues. Thomas, we discussed some of the areas, and Anthony, I know we kind of touched briefly on some of those. Do y'all think it would be helpful to have a roundtable discussion? We would all interact with each other's perspectives.
Sure, I wouldn't have an issue with that at all. That actually sounds like a great deal of fun.
Mhm.
I would personally say that I would like to bring not just a Roman Catholic, but also an Eastern Orthodox into this discussion. So maybe we can drag Craig back in our
Mhm.
next time, because
Mhm.
though he might fall into the classical camp, he would take a different approach than I think a Roman Catholic would take on some of these questions.
Sure,
Mm.
I would even invite having an Islamic theist, a Muslim, on as well. I think that would be immensely beneficial because personally, I don't come across that perspective as often as I would like. So I would love to interact with someone of the
Mhm.
Islamic faith on that topic.
Yeah, it would probably need to be a pretty lengthy roundtable discussion. The more people we add, which I'm fine with that. Just making sure y'all are okay with it. It would be a good 2.5 hours probably when we have 4 or 5 people on there. But if you keep your eyes open for a Muslim who would want to take up, this task, let's get them on there. And I imagine Craig, whenever he is available, would also like to come on. So I think we can make that happen. So what we'll do is off the air, we'll come up with some dates in our chat. And so more to come. Everybody who's watching, please stay tuned. There will be some follow-up discussions for this in the future. Let me ask y'all real quick, how can they get in touch with you? Anthony, you first, Thomas, and then you.
My main platform at the moment, because my website is under construction, is my Facebook platform. You can look me up at the Reform View Facebook page, or you can contact me personally. My page is public. All of my content is public, and you can comment even without being a friend of mine on Facebook at Anthony W. Brooks. Also, you can email me at awbrookstitus278@gmail.com. And that's a good place to email me at. So multiple platforms you can get into contact with me on. I also have a Twitter as well. Don't look at that as much, but you can contact me on that as well until I get my website back up.
Excellent. Thomas, what about you? How can they get in touch with you?
Okay. Well, my personal Facebook really isn't public or anything like that, and I have a pretty defunct atheist Reformation page on there. So I would more encourage people to contact me via email. It's the atheist reformation at gmail.com. That should come to me and have no issues getting to me. I also have a minds.com profile. If you will permit me just a second, I will actually pull that up. It is just simply at Druschke, all lowercase, Druschke. I will be changing that to the Atheist Reformation as soon as I possibly can, because I'm in the process of migrating everything over there. My blog's been kind of defunct for a while, primarily just because life got in the way. But I'm now in a better position to actually provide more regular updates and things like that, and also be on the lookout for a YouTube channel coming in the indefinite future.
Excellent. Well, Anthony, Thomas, thank y'all both for coming on. This was great, and we're going to continue this in the future. So everybody, please look out for that. Thank you both for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks very
All
much.
right. Yes, indeed. Okay, everybody, please like, share, comment, subscribe. And I think that'll do it. So thank you, everyone, for watching. God bless you all.